Welcome to Spink Insider, the podcast where history is valued. My name's Tim Robson. I'm a senior specialist here at Spink. And today, again, I'm with Martyn Downer for another podcast. And we're talking about the three watches that won Trafalgar. The Battle of Trafalgar, there's some controversy about whether it was important during the Napoleonic Wars, whether it had a big impact during the Napoleonic Wars. There's two batches of historians who have very different views. One is it was important and it prevented the invasion of Britain. And the other view is that it didn't do a lot, but it was phenomenally important in the formation of what became the British Empire. I sort of lean towards the British Empire point of view. I'm sure Martyn has a point of view about whether it prevented invasion. I don't think invasion was even on the cards in 1805, particularly. If you imagine that the French and the British have been at war on and off for 200 years, odd, it's a sort of fight for who controls the world, in essence. So you've got a French Empire and you've got a British Empire, and the two empires are basically fighting each other for ultimate control. The Napoleonic generals after the war, and Napoleon himself, stated that the sole intention, if they had won the Battle of Trafalgar, was to send the French fleet into the Channel to bombard the Channel ports, to go up the Thames estuary and destroy all the means that the British had to make ships, so all the shipyards, etc. So he was looking really to knock out the Navy. The British Army was pretty small and not very important on a continental scale. And that was his intention. Had the Battle of Trafalgar been lost, I'm sure that's exactly what he would have done. The fact that Nelson annihilated, I suppose for want of a better word, the combined French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar meant that the British then had a navy which supported all their colonies in the Caribbean and all over the globe. So that's a sort of debate that's been raging backwards and forwards. However, we're here primarily to talk about the three watches that won the Battle of Trafalgar, an amazing group of three watches. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Martyn, to give us some background as to who the watches belong to and what the relationship between the people that own them was.
Thank you, Tim. Well, the first thing I would say, you're right and wrong about Trafalgar.
Oh, well, go on.
In 1805, Napoleon had assembled a large invasion army at Boulogne to invade the United Kingdom. You're correct to say that his likely intention was simply to disrupt the means of production at the dockyards, and to cause mayhem rather than to seize the territory for his growing empire. But by the time of the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, the army had moved east, following the joining with the British of the Austrians and Russians into a new coalition, which threatened Napoleon's hold on Western Europe. So he diverted his army to face them. The battle itself, accordingly, has sometimes been described, as you say, as less important in a geopolitical sense than it might otherwise have been. But it did secure British supremacy at sea, not just during the Napoleonic War, whilst they lasted, but also into the 19th century. Really, one could argue up until the First World War. Most importantly, it enabled Britain to endure the war, to support its war on land. Industrial production was maintained, and also to preserve its very important colonial possessions, particularly in the West Indies, which paid for the war. Mm-hmm. So shortly before the Battle of Trafalgar, the French fleet, under Napoleon's direct order, had gone down to the West Indies with orders to cause a lot of mayhem in the West Indies to disrupt British trade. In fact, they kind of bottled it when they got there and turned back to Europe, and ultimately went back into port at Cadiz where they came out, of course, famously just before the Battle of Trafalgar. So Napoleon was, of course, a supreme commander of forces on land, had a very large land army, knew everything about controlling and directing armies on land, and he treated his fleet in much the same way, but it was a very unrealistic way to treat a fleet. So when he was moving his fleet around on a chessboard, it wasn't quite as straightforward as moving an army around on land, because, of course, you're dealing with the variables of weather and everything else. So by the time of the battle, on the 21st of October, the French and Spanish fleet had been holed up at Cadiz. They wanted to make for the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. Britain had been, since the collapse of the Peace of Amiens, been blockading Cadiz. And finally, Villeneuve had to leave because Cadiz could no longer support a very large fleet of some 33 warships. And they were running out of supplies, so they had to make for the Mediterranean. The three watches that are in front of us had been assembled by a collector of important artifacts relating to Nelson. And it's a spectacular group because these three watches, one belonged to Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood, who was Nelson's second in command at the Battle of Trafalgar, himself a highly regarded and respected naval commander. The second watch belonged to Captain Hardy, Captain Thomas Masterman Hardy, who was Nelson's flag captain in HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. And most spectacularly of all, of course, is the supreme example of a watch belonging to a notable figure from history, is the pocket watch that Nelson carried himself on that fateful day and at the time of his death. So these three watches have been reassembled together. The last time
so just so the listeners and watchers understand, so these watches were in their pockets, so to speak.
Yes,
during the Battle of Trafalgar, so they were there.
These three watches were with these officers, Collingwood, Hardy, and Nelson. Carried at the Battle of Trafalgar, and they've only been reunited in the last few years. The Hardy watch and the Nelson watch were exhibited together in 1891 when they were brought together for an exhibition in London, but then were parted again, and they've only recently been reunited. And we will come to the battle and how the battle happened and what happened to these watches during the battle. But it's a remarkable moment of historical serendipity that they are assembled back together. And in many ways, looking at them, they represent their officers as well. So to go through the watches briefly, I suppose Captain Hardy to begin with. Captain Hardy was born in 1769. He was the youngest of the three officers. He had fought with Nelson previously. He'd been at all Nelson's previous fleet actions at Cape St. Vincent and Copenhagen and the Nile. And this watch was made in the 1740s. So it's much earlier. It was some 80 years old or 60, 70 years old by the time of the Battle of Trafalgar. And it's clearly a family watch. Hardy himself came from sort of middling gentry family, farming family in Dorset. This is probably a family watch that was given to him maybe by his father or a family member, which he treasured and kept throughout his career. And the second watch, the watch belonged to Cuthbert Collingwood. Collingwood, similar background to Hardy. He came from Northumberland near Newcastle, Morpeth. And that watch he actually bought in 1803. So Collingwood was the oldest of the three men. He'd been born, I think, in 1749. So he was some 10 years older than Nelson. But he'd known Nelson for most of their careers. They'd served together in the West Indies in the 1770s and 80s. They were close friends throughout their careers. Their careers overlapped. And they were brought together faithfully at Trafalgar. Collingwood, which wasn't unusual in those days, had spent most of his life at sea, certainly during times of war. And when he did eventually get home in 1802, 1803 for the Peace of Amiens, he went and purchased this watch. And then he carried it with him, and it was carried by him at the Battle of Trafalgar 2 years later. The third watch, of course, which is a very celebrated watch and quite a famous object, has a kind of iconic status as a historic relic, because this is the watch, in itself a very important watch made by a famous watchmaker called Josiah Emery, who was one of the very top names in London watchmaking in the late 18th century. And this watch was owned by Horatio Nelson, of course, the great figure and the ultimate commander at Trafalgar. Emery, I think, died in 1797-98. So the watch predates Trafalgar, and it's such an expensive watch, there's likely to have been a gift to Nelson from an admirer. Emery made very few supreme examples of his craft, and I think he made some 35 of these very rare lever escapement watches, which is like the cutting edge of technology at that time, of which this is an example. And he made for the crown and for monarchs around Europe. So this was likely a gift to Nelson after the Battle of the Nile from an admiring monarch or prince, which Nelson treasured.
He was interested in timekeeping.
Well, he was, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I read he was a fanatic about time.
Well, time in the 18th century was a more variable, more variable notion than we have today, perhaps, because time varied more than it does today in sense of accuracy. But Nelson, throughout his naval career, Nelson hasn't so many strands. He's such a complex figure, but he was first and foremost incredibly efficient, disciplined naval officer. So throughout his career, he would keep a weather log, which meant every day he would take sightings of the weather for himself, for his own personal use, and write them in a log. And up until the day before the Battle of Trafalgar, he did this. And he would, in the weather log, examples of which survive in the British Library, he would take a time, 7 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 4 o'clock, checking his watch and check the weather and note the weather. And he was very good at predicting weather. He was a very good forecaster, which of course could save your life at sea. So he took an immense interest in the weather and accordingly time. And we know that on the morning of the Battle of Trafalgar, the fleets approached each other off Cadiz as the combined French and Spanish fleet made for the Straits of Gibraltar. To their surprise and horror, they realized that over the horizon there were 27 British warships. They hadn't expected such a large force to be off Cadiz. It came as a surprise to them. And Villeneuve, Pierre Villeneuve, the ultimate commander of the combined fleet, decided to head back towards Cadiz to run for port because he realized he couldn't get to the Straits before the British intercepted him. Of course, he failed in that ambition. So the fleets sighted each other at dawn on the 21st of October, 1805. They were some 10 miles distant from each other. And the weather prevailing conditions being what they were at the time, although there was a bit of a swell, which Nelson, knowing his weather, realized there was a storm approaching. And of course, famously, a storm did hit the fleet the day after.
The swell is quite important, isn't it? From what I read later on in the battle.
Yes.
When you're trying
and
to
the British fleet were windward, so they were carried on the swell towards the French and Spanish forces. But the French and Spanish, the closing speed was only at a walking pace, which meant that every man in both fleets could watch their approaching fate for hours before they could engage. I read when because of the swell, when they did start to open fire, the French and the Spanish, because their ships were doing this, it was actually quite difficult for them to be reasonably accurate with the. Yes,
with the shout.
Ultimately, it's often said that the reason that the British fleet prevailed at the action was because our gunnery skills were higher.
Oh, good, yeah.
We could certainly fire quicker. We used triggers rather than fuses on our guns. So we prevailed through gunnery skills, but nevertheless, he was still subject to the conditions of the sea, of course. So the decks were cleared, the men were got ready for action at dawn. But it would be another 6 hours before they engaged. So there's a lot of anxious anticipation during which the men were given wine and some food. We know from accounts that some of them sang or scrawled messages on their guns in chalk. Nelson himself called his frigate captains to his cabin on the morning of the battle, his 4 closest frigate captains, to give them final instructions. The frigates would be moving around the fleet during the action, relaying messages and so forth, orders. And we know from the account of the surgeon in the ship, William Beatty, who would later be with Nelson as he lay dying below, that Nelson, at about 10 o'clock, called Lieutenant Pascoe, Mr. Ogilvy, and some other officers near him, and desired them to set their watches by the time of that which his lordship wore. So this is the watch that at 10 o'clock that morning, he checked his watch and gave them his time to these frigate captains before they returned to their ships to engage the enemy. The action opened at about 12:30. Nelson had directed that his fleet of some 27 warships should divide into 2 columns, 2 divisions, led one by himself and one by Cuthbert Collingwood. So we have the 2 watches in front of us that led those columns. And Collingwood's flagship Royal Sovereign engaged the enemy first, probably slightly to Nelson's disappointment. Nelson wanted to probably lead from the front, although he had been encouraged, and in fact, his officers had appealed to him that he shouldn't lead from the front, that he should maybe even switch to a different ship, and certainly take off the decorations on his coat to avoid standing out.
I also read that the Royal Sovereign had a new copper bottom.
The Royal Sovereign had been coppered more recently and sailed a bit faster. The prevailing conditions around the ship might have been slightly better, the column might have turned earlier. The sailing order, Nelson had given very precise orders for the sailing orders for both columns as they wore their ships round, turned their ships towards the enemy. But, in the moment, the order wasn't quite what he wanted. But nevertheless, it was an incredibly complicated and ultimately brilliant strategy. In fact, one of the great mysteries of naval history today is, how on earth, if anyone's ever been to HMS Victory, this vast machine sitting down in its dry dock in Portsmouth, it's unimaginable how they not only could work that machine, they had 800 men in it, sail the machine, and then bring it into action in a good condition in front of the enemy under gun fire is an extraordinary skill. And no one knows quite how they did it. It would have required instinctive skills that we no longer know. So Nelson engaged the enemy because his aim was to attack the combined fleet at right angles, which was unconventional. You usually line up parallel lines to fire upon each other. It meant that for a long approach to engaging the enemy, his column and Collingwood's column would be under fire, unable to effect an effective return fire because their guns, of course, were pointing away from the enemy as they approached. And again, highly risky and dangerous procedure. And unsurprisingly, some of the greatest casualties in the action were on HMS Victory for any ship. And the most vulnerable position in an action was on the deck, naturally. And Nelson, being Nelson, would always, he was expected within himself to stand proudly on the deck to direct his fleet. He never sought cover. The other men were, in fact, as they approached, the other men were ordered to lie down behind the bulwarks and stuff. But Nelson and his other officers were expected to stand as they approached. And in fact, as they approached, even before I think Victory had offered any return fire. So Nelson's secretary, John Scott, had been standing beside Nelson and Hardy on the quarterdeck as they approached the enemy. And early in the action, his body was torn asunder by a shot that hit him mid-drifts and literally cut in half, standing within a foot or two of Nelson and Hardy. And even by the standards of Nelson's career, it must have been one of the most terrifying actions that he and Hardy had experienced together. They'd been at the Nile together. These watches in front of us were also there within a foot or two as Scott was cut in half, which is an extraordinary thought. Nelson turned to Hardy and said this will be warm work, because they were still unable to fully engage the enemy until they had hit the enemy line. When they did hit the enemy line, they soon became entangled with a French ship called Redoutable, and so close did they become entangled that the Victory was really unable to bring to bear its broadsides on the enemy ship, and the French ship sent a lot of snipers up into the upper yards of their sail or their masts to snipe down and to shoot down on the Victory's deck. And of course, at about 1:30, Nelson himself was struck in the shoulder by a musket ball, enemy musket ball. Probably not intentionally. I mean, it was feasible to obviously aim, but the aim was inaccurate at the best of times, and certainly in the swaying masts, they were probably just peppering the deck. Nelson fell onto his side. He probably fell in all to the blood and guts that were already on the deck, and was carried below with this watch. So
and apparently the shot apparently went down through his shoulder, through his body, and it lodged in his
lower spine, yes.
Yeah, and he was well aware, even as that happened, as to...
Well, he realised immediately that...
he
turned to Hardy and said, Hardy was trying to be encouraging, but he turned immediately to Hardy to say, no, I know this is, the game's up. But he remained conscious, and in fact, he would remain conscious for the following 3 hours or so, down below at the all-up deck where they carried the wounded, with the surgeon, and subsequently developed around him the scene that's now become kind of immortalized in British history, the scene of Nelson lying, having been stripped of his uniform, in his breeches pocket of which was this watch. And whilst the surgeon examined him, and then they could do nothing except relieve his pain and try and quench his raging thirst as he lay there. Nelson's two anxieties, he knew he was going to die, didn't know how long he had. His two anxieties were to secure or to know that he had secured a big victory, which he was assured of by Hardy towards the end of that afternoon. And also his first thoughts went to his lover, Emma Lady Hamilton, who that day was at the house they shared together at Martyn in South London in Surrey, blissfully unaware, although very anxious about Nelson's fate. And he was particularly keen that she should be, well looked after following his death.
Was she?
He looked after her to a degree. Her husband, Sir William Hamilton, had left her a pension. However, even long time before Trafalgar, both she and Emma and Nelson had been petitioning the government to secure her a government pension for her work as the wife of the British ambassador in Naples. And she had a legitimate claim to government money because she had undoubtedly been instrumental in securing Neapolitan support for the British fleet at the lowest point of the war, when otherwise Britain was effectively locked out of the Mediterranean. But the King of Naples, and more particularly the Queen of Naples, Marie Antoinette's sister, Maria Carolina, supported the British. And that was largely because of the hard work that Emma Hamilton did. So she had a claim, but it was ignored. It was ignored largely because there was a prevailing establishment disapproval of her relationship with Nelson, and probably a slightly misogynistic view towards her. So he was very anxious that even at the moment of his death, that Nelson knew, his fame was such, he was probably at that stage the most celebrated man in England. He knew that his final words would be pored over by the public and published. So he made absolutely sure that not only as he lay dying that he made his pleas, which were duly published, but also hours before, in his cabin by himself, he'd also written out a codicil to his will, further instructing that the government should support Emma Hamilton. The government did not support Emma Hamilton. At that stage, the government really took its lead from the Prince of Wales, later Prince Regent, and later George IV. And he had already tried his luck with Emma Hamilton and failed. And so he viewed her unsympathetically. And so although she had been provided enough by Nelson before his death and by her husband, Sir William Hamilton, to survive, the lifestyle to which she had become accustomed, she could no longer support. And she probably sought to prolong the lifestyle beyond a sense. I mean, it's often said that, she drank herself away or gambled for money. It was really harsh. There's always been a lot of... I'm an enormous fan of Emma Hamilton. I think she's the most one of the remarkable women of the 18th century. And in herself, she was more famous than Nelson before the Battle of the Nile across Europe. She was the most represented woman in print culture and portrait world. And of course, we know her now because of her association largely with Nelson, but she was a remarkable woman and she was really hard done by. And it was a combination of her own inability to cut back her lifestyle and also a failure of government to respond to Nelson, whereas, of course, his brother received a massive windfall after Trafalgar.
Well, what I don't understand is what happened to the wife. I mean, why didn't he just divorce her, wasn't it?
Well, divorce in those days was not a straightforward business. It required an Act of Parliament.
An Act of Parliament.
And at that time, Nelson was a serving senior naval officer. It wasn't unusual for men in positions to have lovers. The Prince of Wales having set the tone, and so I think they'd reached an understanding, and Lady Nelson was generously provided for by Nelson. She was paid £3,000 a year by Nelson during his lifetime after they separated, which was a substantial amount of money. And she received a pension after his death from his estate. But this watch, so when he died, they won the great victory at Trafalgar, but the victory, of course, was completely overshadowed by Nelson's death. The fleet then limped into, after a storm which duly hit the fleets the day after, as Nelson had predicted. They lost their prizes. They took 19 prizes from the enemy, not prize ships. They captured 19 ships, which was just a quite extraordinary number. At the Battle of the Nile, Nelson's other great victory, and also seen as one of the greatest naval victories in history, he'd achieved 11 ships captured or destroyed. So 19.
That's a lot of money for the
huge
for the
amount,
crews,
millions, multi-millions of pounds. Not only to be shared amongst the officers, but also by the men. And indeed, when they lost the ships and the storm that followed, government was generous enough to recompense the people who'd served at Trafalgar with prize money.
That wouldn't happen now, of course.
That wouldn't happen now.
No.
So they limped their fleet eventually into Gibraltar to be mended up and fitted up to get back to England. And they reached, the news of Trafalgar reached England in early November. The fleet itself straggled back in bits and pieces. Collingwood himself remained on blockade duty after the battle, as if, it's quite extraordinary in our eyes. Collingwood went to sea in 1803 to join the campaign which led to Trafalgar in 1805. He never went home again, and he died in 1810. He was at sea continuously for 7 years with this watch.
Well, did he ever go on land? He must have
he went on land.
Wobbled all over the place.
But he never saw his family after 1803 before his death in 1810, because he was constantly kept at sea blockading the French or Spanish ports, which is that wouldn't happen today.
No.
A quite extraordinary degree of duty. And this watch that's in front of us was with him until his death. So Nelson's possessions were landed when the Victory eventually crept into the Thames in December 1805, a couple of months after the action, with Nelson's body on board, famously preserved in a leaguer or a barrel of spirits, and apparently very well preserved. An autopsy was undertaken on Nelson's body, and an artist was present to sketch Nelson's body, to sketch the ball that had killed him, which is now at Windsor Castle, and also to produce a posthumous portrait of Nelson, quite a famous image now, which was then used to produce a magnificent painting of the death of Nelson, which is now at the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. Nelson's possessions were then carried by Captain Blackwood, who has been one of those frigate captains who'd seen him on the morning of the battle, and Nelson's servant, to meet with Nelson's brother, William Nelson, who had been ennobled unfairly, but had been ennobled in his brother's honour as Earl Nelson following the action. for what is one of the sort of great bedside scenes of history, at the bedside of Emma Hamilton in her house at Clarges Street, which is off Piccadilly, when they opened and inspected the possessions that had been with Nelson at the time of his death, in his cabin and upon his person. And this watch was one of those objects that was inspected, was listed by Nelson's prize agent, Alexander Davison, who was present at the inspection of these possessions, and was noted down as a gold watch carried by Nelson at Trafalgar, together with a purse that Nelson carried at the time of his death, which was sold at Sotheby's 25 years ago and now is in the Museum of Qatar. So this watch here is the only object that was with Nelson at the time of, personally carried by Nelson and was with him at the time of the death, which is no longer in a museum. Unlike many things that Nelson owned, some went to Emma Hamilton. She claimed some. She wanted his bloodstained uniform that had been cut off him when he was taken below at the time of his wound. And in fact, for some days, she lay beneath the bloodstained uniform in bed and clutched it. But eventually she returned it to Earl Nelson, who demanded it. Relationships between Earl Nelson and Emma Hamilton very quickly deteriorated. And there became a bit of a struggle between what she could retain, objects in their property that she'd shared with Lord Nelson at Martyn, and objects which Earl Nelson saw as family heirlooms. And the heirlooms he's envisaged as belonging to him, i.e., and also to his title as the Earl, were Nelson's orders and decorations, the various stars that had been awarded to him, the Order of the Bath, and Order of Crescent from the Sultan of Turkey, and those things which were seen as non-heraldically important or non-heirloom, which he allowed Emma Hamilton to keep. So porcelain, glassware, domestic things. But there was a core group of family heirlooms, and this watch was very definitely one of those. They remained with the family, the orders, this gold watch, and were photographed together in 1895 at the house of Viscount Bridport. Viscount Bridport was Nelson's great nephew. Nelson, of course, had a daughter. Well, he had a daughter with Emma Hamilton, a legitimate daughter, Horatia, who had no claim on anything. So Earl Nelson himself inherited the heirlooms, and his own son died very young, leaving him just with a daughter, Charlotte, who had known Nelson in her childhood and in fact had lived with Nelson and Emma Hamilton at Martyn. And in due course, the heirlooms, the medals, this gold watch, were inherited by Charlotte, and there's a picture of Charlotte here. And Charlotte strikes me as a very formidable and impressive person. She had the watch that she'd inherited from her father, Nelson's pocket watch at Trafalgar, mounted in this form for display. And she insisted that it would be handed down through the family to men in her family who served subsequently in the Royal Navy. And this watch and Nelson's gold medals and his diamond set jewels were all photographed in 1895. They were then bought by the British nation in one of the first purchases of the kind for the national collection by a special instruction of Queen Victoria, and presented to Greenwich Royal Hospital, for display. And they were displayed all together in the Painted Hall at Greenwich, except for this watch, because, of course, Charlotte had insisted that this watch be retained for presentation. So the others were sold to the government, but this watch was retained by the family to be passed down through succeeding generations of naval officers, which meant that when a thief came into the Painted Hall in 1901 to steal all Nelson's medals and other treasures, this watch avoided that theft, which means that this is not only one of the most radioactive historic objects connected to Nelson that remains, it's the only piece remaining of that huge group of very precious heirlooms.
What happened to the others? Were they ever?
Well, the fear is they were stolen and destroyed, melted down.
Oh.
None of them have appeared again since. Someone was subsequently arrested, but things were not able to be recovered. So the watch itself is incredibly precious memento.
And very personal too.
And incredibly personal.
Yeah.
Because it would have been one of the last things that Nelson would have looked at during his lifetime, carried with him. But seeing it together, like this with Hardy's watch remained with the Hardy family as well after the battle. As I said earlier, it was displayed with Nelson's watch in 1891 in Chelsea. It was retained by Captain Hardy's family down in Dorset until it was sold at auction in 1938. And then it disappeared. And it came back to light a number of years ago when it was purchased and reunited with Nelson's watch. Likewise, Collingwood's watch, which he purchased on that last leave home in 1803 before departing for eventually the Battle of Trafalgar, and then another further 5 years at sea before his own death, was sold by the Collingwood family in the 1970s, and so also lost. And so to see the three of them, Collingwood himself last saw Nelson on the 20th of October, so the day before the battle, when these three watches, Hardy would have been with Nelson as Nelson's flag captain, were together in Nelson's cabin on the 20th of October, 1805. Collingwood then departed for his flagship Royal Sovereign and never saw Nelson again. And of course, Hardy and Nelson were together on the 21st. So it's a remarkable moment to have them together, but also they represent each officer in their type of watch,
yes,
and their history of the watch, and what they mean to the families and what they mean to us now. And the great attraction and beauty of historic objects is that by looking upon these very personal, intimate objects, which were kept very close, they were very precious to the officers and kept close, but also they were incredibly important objects because their life could depend on their timekeeping. To see them assembled is more instructive about the officers and about the action than perhaps reading an account of it. Similarly, with these watches comes a chart of a collection of sea charts. The sea charts were captured by Nelson at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent from a Spanish warship called the San Josef, which he boarded in one of the most heroic actions of his career.
Is that where he led the men on?
He led the men across
front.
the deck of one enemy ship onto the deck of another, in which Nelson, being very modest, described as his bridge technique. And they took, as they would, when they captured an enemy ship, they'd take all the intelligence documents, which were the charts, and timekeepers and scientific instruments they found in enemy ships, because they were vital intelligence. And they captured a book of Spanish charts of the Spanish coast. Obviously, the Spanish had the best charts of the Spanish coast. And these charts remained with Nelson up until the Battle of Trafalgar. And on the charts, which are going to be sold by Spink together with the watches in December, there are annotations on the charts where you can see Nelson, but more probably his master, Thomas Atkinson, the master of HMS Victory, marking the track of his fleet and the track of the ships in the fleet. So they would make pencil marks on the charts as they tracked themselves and the enemy across the ocean. And after the action, the charts were recovered by William Beattie, the surgeon who'd been with Nelson throughout the day of the battle, and was retained by Beattie as a souvenir of the action, and was eventually loaned to the Greenwich Hospital, and then was sold a few years ago. So the timekeepers here, together with the printed Spanish captured charts showing the annotations of Nelson and his ship's master, sailing master, Thomas Atkinson, in the hours before Trafalgar, can bring that action alive in a way that no description could.
It's slightly bizarre, isn't it? Because they're fairly static objects, but in terms of where they've been,
yes,
which was an incredibly bloody battle with hundreds of thousands of casualties and bits of body flying around and decks awash with body parts and goodness knows what, and here they are sitting on the table.
One of the attractions for me of this whole subject is, I mean, I'm a great enthusiast for the 18th century and the culture of the 18th century and the lifestyle of the 18th century and objects and artworks from the 18th century. And the way these officers behaved and lived in their warships is quite extraordinary to us. And they would live in Nelson's cabin. For people who've been to Victory, it's a very elegant, small but very elegant drawing room. And he would carry into action his porcelain, his silverware. We knew he carried a lot of silver with him, artworks, furnishings, and precious objects like his gold watch. And they would dine on the morning of the action, although they would clear everything. And his cabin became a gun deck because there were guns in his cabin. So they cleared everything for action. But they were moving around his furniture and his plate and his glassworks. And they lived up until the moment of fighting. They lived as if they were, having breakfast in a manor house in Somerset. I mean, it was
it's quite rural.
And then they would step out of their cabin, dressed in their, there was no way that Nelson, although his officers suggested he take off his bejeweled coat, there was no way Nelson was going to do that because that would have been unseemly for him to put a plain coat on. He stepped out wearing his breeches and his coat with all his stars on, carrying his gold watch, carrying a purse that was sold a few years ago, as I mentioned, full of gold guineas, as if he was just stepping out in a ballroom. But he's actually stepping into hell. There was body parts and they could hardly see in front of them with the smoke. So the idea of that disconnect between the elegance of the way that these people lived or aspired to live and their behavior that they aspired to, compared to the hellish conditions in which they were thrust by virtue of their careers, is such a disconnect that it's just stark.
Well, not only that, when you're talking about they advanced on the crescent of the combined French and Spanish fleets at 2-3 miles an hour. And it took them, I don't know how many hours it took them, but you can see what you're heading into, and yet they're singing Rule Britannia and it's all very jolly.
Well, it could be a bit of false confidence. I mean, I don't think anyone in either fleet was under any misapprehension about the chaos that was about to happen, because, I mean, one of the things that, if there's one sight in history that I'd like to have seen, would be that sight, the spectacle, the majesty of it. The combined Spanish and French fleets stretched over some 3 or 4 miles of 33 very large warships. You imagine 33 victories in a line. They're a bit disorderly because they were in a disorder. They come out of Cadiz in a disorderly manner, but they stretched over 3 miles. The British fleet approaching them on a similar scale, to see 60 warships gathered together in maybe 4 square miles would have been such a remarkable sight, one of the great sights of history, and magnificent, but also horrendous because of the death. And although, having said this, the casualties, certainly by the standards of later in the 19th century, and certainly by 20th century standards, were light. The British lost some 2,000 men, and I think the enemy combined fleet lost maybe 12 or 15,000 men, a much heavier casualty rate. But there's a pale into comparison to 60,000 the first day of the Somme or whatever. And in fact, in Victory, 57 men were killed in Victory, and I think they were all killed on the deck. There were no one killed below decks. So
I thought they were raked, and some cannonball went
along the decks, but and they're shot. But the safest place to be was below decks, unless you sank or blew up, because you were well protected. So Nelson not only put himself in the leading ship, but he also was in the most vulnerable position. He was, very vulnerable.
So what happened to Collingwood's ship?
Royal Sovereign.
As opposed to the Victory, because they were the other first ship into the Maelstrom.
Later?
No, during the battle.
So Royal Sovereign had I don't know which ship the Royal Sovereign engaged, but when they both tackled the enemy, they were immediately surrounded. Nelson had led the Victory initially into a different position. What he really wanted to do was engage the French flagship upon which Villeneuve was stationed, the Bucentaure. They weren't aware in which position the Bucentaure was before Villeneuve raised his flag. So initially Nelson was aiming for a different part of the line, and then sort of headed southwards down the line late on, in the final approach to engage Villeneuve, which he did, and was soon engaged on all sides. And as I said, they couldn't bring their guns to bear until very late on, and it was likewise for Collingwood's Royal Sovereign. Some of the ships at the battle, on both sides, probably escaped a lot more lightly than others. Some were in the thick of it, some were on the fringes of it. The Bellerophon, which was a famous British warship, I think had the heaviest casualties. No one came off too lightly.
No. One of the interesting things I read was that the British chucked all the dead stuff overboard. They didn't keep the bodies at all.
No.
Whereas the French and Spanish did. They loaded them up on the deck. So when they came back into Cadiz or wherever, there's thousands of people with legs missing and arms missing. But it's very Royal Navy, that, isn't it? Well, he's not much use to us anymore. So over the side he goes. It's very disciplined and organised.
It's probably more Catholic to keep the bodies.
Yeah.
And bodies were floating up and being landed on the beaches along that coastline, for weeks afterwards.
Yeah.
So, naval historians and naval collectors love objects connected to the great actions. There's no greater action in British naval history than Trafalgar.
No.
For multiple of reasons. It's framed not only in terms of a great naval victory, but because Nelson achieved such an extraordinary death. Not only was he wounded at the height of the action, but he was allowed time to linger. It was the classic deathbed scene, which I think Nelson himself would have been quite pleased about. He was not pleased about, but he would have been.
You have the "Kiss Me Hardy," which I remember from school.
Yeah,
everybody giggles. "Kiss Me Hardy."
Yeah.
I didn't realise he got kissed twice actually. Once on the cheek and once on the forehead.
Yeah, I don't think that's. I think male affection in those times was
very different.
Yeah, and they're brotherly. They'd served together.
What did he go on to do? Because he was the captain of the Victory. Was he during the
Hardy
battle?
was the flag captain in Victory. He then continued his career, and then following the war, he rose to be admiral. And then following the war, he became governor of Greenwich Hospital, where he died and is buried now. And there's lots of monuments to Hardy at Greenwich.
Right. Okay. It is a stunning group.
Yeah. So the watch itself, just to close, the Nelson's watch and I have a long-standing relationship because, as I said, it was handed down through members of the Hood family, who was Nelson's cousins, to be preserved from members of the Hood family who served in the Royal Navy. And when that line ran out, it was lent to the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. And in 2004, shortly before the bicentenary of the Battle of Trafalgar, I was contacted by a lovely person who'd been bequeathed the watch unexpectedly. And so I visited with her the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich, where the watch was in store. It wasn't on display. And so it was then consigned for auction at Sotheby's, where I then worked, for a sale dedicated to Nelson to coincide with the bicentenary of Trafalgar. And it achieved a huge amount of publicity at the time in 2005. And indeed, on the bicentenary day itself, 21st of October 2005, I appeared on Richard and Judy with this watch, which in many ways was less fun than today. And
you only had 2 minutes.
And they gave me more wine, and with this watch, and it achieved a lot of national press and coverage. And before the auction sale at Sotheby's, a private philanthropist contacted us to intervene to prevent the watch being sold overseas. And he made a a very large offer for the watch to secure it, to prevent it being competed for, it being of such incredible national importance and such a symbolic object from British history, iconic. And he secured it and then lent it to the National Maritime Museum and insisted that it was displayed in the museum. Yeah. And indeed, it was displayed in the museum for then the following 10, 12 years or so. And when he died, it was sold again at Sotheby's when purchased by the current owner. So it's been in and out of the National Collection on loan. And now for the second time in his life is being sold at auction. So I feel, the watch and I have we've had a long-standing relationship. I've seen it, I've handled it a number of times in and out, and it has, I've got good memories about it.
Oh, I mean, do you have any notion as to what sort of person will want to buy it?
Well, a rich person.
Well, or someone who's a bit of a romantic like yourself, perhaps.
I think that for anyone, the watch itself is by the leading watchmaker of the 18th century, Josiah Emery. However, it's not a watch that's going to appeal to watch collectors per se. It's going to appeal to people who want to own history. And the watches themselves, they're fine watches in themselves, but the relationship between them is so strong and so significant that you have to be a romantic, I suppose. You then also have the world's best after dinner conversation to discuss and to display. I would hope that they remain together and stay together. It's taken 200 years to put them back together, that they remain together for the future, to be enjoyed by as many people as possible, because the mere survival of the three watches carried by the three most significant men at the Battle of Trafalgar, and that they stood be on the table in front of us is quite extraordinary. And one would hope that can be maintained.
Well, if their ghosts are looking on, we hope that they will go to a good home.
Yes.
Thank you, Martyn. That was wonderful. And it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, listeners and watchers. It's always good to have you here, whether you're running around with the dog or doing the washing up or sitting on a train listening to it. It's been good to have you here. If you have any comments, please let us know.